today I'm privileged to be speaking with James Valliant. James, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. I've been looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. And I want to give a brief bio and then have you add a little bit of extra flavor to what I know about you so far. You're a native of Los Angeles, and I see, obtained a degree in philosophy from New York University and a Juris Doctorate from the University of San Diego. And for over 17 years, you were a deputy district attorney for the County of San Diego. And for many years, you were an expert commentator on religious, legal, and political issues for various local television news programs in the San Diego area. And you were the host and co-creator of the award-winning television interview program, Ideas in Action. And could you tell us a little bit more about your experience with all that?
Well, I became a lawyer because since a kid I was a big fan of Perry Mason as a kid, and I wanted to be sort of the hero in court doing justice. And it was my dream, really. And since I was a kid, I enjoyed that work, did it for almost 18 years, prosecuted murder cases, child molest cases, difficult rape cases, even did appellate work before the California Supreme Court. And in terms of learning how to investigate and do forensic work, it's important. It's the same sort of mindset that historical researchers bring. So it was excellent experience that way, just simply in doing historical research as well. But I love puzzles and mysteries, so
that's awesome.
The nature of my mind.
And you obviously at some point kind of switched gears. What took you more into the writing field away from the television programs?
Well, I always knew I wanted to do some writing, and I was raised a Christian, very standard Christian, brought up in a Presbyterian church. And when I was a kid, I took religion very, very seriously. I think it almost disturbed my parents how seriously I took religion. There was at one point, if you at like the age of 10 or 11, if you'd asked me, what do you want to be when you grow up? I wouldn't have said lawyer yet. I would have said a clergyman. I would have said a theologian or a scholar in religion, believe it or not. And so even as a little kid, I was into it and reading stuff way above my head. Now, there came a point very early in my teens where I sort of had a religious crisis and lost my faith. And I began to explore all kinds of variant Christianities. And then more than that, I began to study secular literature and then hardcore atheist literature and stuff. Began to read philosophy. And but I had all this knowledge about Christianity in my head, right? And I knew I wanted to do something with it one day. And in terms of my work on Christianity, it began way back, or in the early 1980s. I was working at a law firm as a clerk, a famous law firm in downtown LA, O'Melveny and Myers, and really famous. I went up in the elevator one day with Henry Kissinger, and one of the partners there was Warren Christopher, Bill Clinton's Secretary of State. So it was a high-powered law firm, and it was there that I realized I didn't want to be a high-powered lawyer. I wanted to be the guy in court. But it was also then that I started doing some real research into the history of Christianity. And what was it, 1982 or 83, I had a light bulb went on in my head about Roman provenance. And so actually it's been over 30 years that I've been diligently trying to figure this out, but it's taken that long to do so. So all the time I was being a deputy district attorney and a commentator on TV and so forth, I was still continuously working on my religion in general, philosophy in general, Christianity.
Amazing. And I do want to get into the book a little bit later, but just for the moment, one quick question. I see there's a co-author. How did you all go 50-50 on the book, or is one of you more editing, or how did that work?
That is really an amazing story in itself. My co-author and I have known each other since we were in elementary school, quite literally. I was, 10 years old when I met him. He was my older brother's best friend. And so we went on camp trips together and we talked. Well, my family very much encouraged philosophical conversation, even with their kids. And it was a really amazing household to grow up in. And so we had all kinds of discussions about anything, and I grew up with him in that way. And so when I had this insight, you know, when I was about 20 years old, it hit me all, you know, just, he was the guy I had to go to. And so I went over to his apartment and I pounded on, it was late at night. I should not have done this. No warning. I come over, I'm pounding frantically on his window. Wake up, he's got to wake up, dude. And of course, after about 20 minutes, he finally comes to the door. He's unshaven and he's in his boxers. Oh, Jim, this better be good. You're just woken me up. I go, no, really, it's exciting. So he lets me in and I now start downloading on my theory. And we were up for the next, I don't know, 20 hours, taking notes, writing it. And at the end of that first conversation, he said, we're going to write a book about this. Now,
That's awesome.
He is actually a professional writer.
And what is his name, by the way, again?
Warren Fahy.
Warren
Fahy.
Okay.
And he, New York Times bestseller list, Random House author. His novels have been translated into 20 languages. He sold the film rights to one of his books. It's in production right now with a big producer who owns the rights. So he's a successful writer. And I knew my writing skills were, you know, I thought the history wonk and I thought he was the writer. And so I kind of thought I would be doing most of the historical research and he would be cleaning it up so that people could understand what the heck I was saying. I have the curse of someone trained in history and law, the passive voice, you know, and it sort of came to be that rather than he did this and she did that, I was, you know, it came to pass, you know, and so he would correct me with the clarity of my language and so forth, better style. But as time wore on, no, it began to shift. He began to do some of the research into the coins and images, which I thought was absolutely remarkable because once I got him going on that, boy, he really became an expert in his own right in that whole thing. And my writing skills got better working with him, of course. By the time we were done, and this is literally, he was the one actually who discovered the big image that we use, the anchor and fish image. Right. He was the one that discovered the significance of that, not me. Although the original historical ideas and laying it out were mine. By the time, though, we were done, it was like a total fusion of two minds. Every single word, every single semicolon was approved and gone back and had 3 different versions. The editing process was absolutely amazing because not until both of us were super, super, super pleased did even a word go in. But he ended up doing a lot of the historical research, and he said, I was amazed. His own mother read it and said, oh, I'm so proud of you. You know, you put that literary flourish in there, and I knew it was you. And he said, no, that was the history wonk. He put in that literary flourish. So at the end of the day, he contributed to the history almost as much as I did, and I contributed to the literary aspects almost as much as he did. So it was a true collaboration.
That's awesome.
It's our baby. You know, it's like 2 parents making a baby. Yeah. We really, and literally, we're at the point that we can read a line and neither of us can tell who wrote the line. It was literally a fusion of 2 minds.
And all that before Google Docs and online collaboration, right?
Exactly right. But you know something, though, the internet was a massive help to our research.
I bet.
It would have been hard to do a comprehensive survey of ancient Roman and Jewish coinage, for example, without the internet providing us examples of these images. We would otherwise have had to go to museums throughout Europe and America to look at the actual coins to get the evidence we needed, or to look at the actual frescoes and mosaics to get the evidence that we needed. The internet provided us high quality images of nearly all of it now.
That's
so
amazing.
That's
awesome. Yeah, I've been enjoying, I haven't dove into that as much at the coins yet, but I've been looking recently at some of the astrotheology stuff and came across many websites where they have shown like ancient synagogues where you'd think, you know, their focus is probably not going to be on things like the zodiac and the equinoxes, and yet right there in their synagogues, you know, in the frescoes, you know, hardwired, so to speak, into their building, you've got these zodiac signs right there, and it's amazing to be able to see it all without having to go look
starting at least Hellenistic times and throughout Roman times. Perhaps the single most common kind of image you'd find in synagogues are zodiac signs, which is a remarkable sort of thing to, you know, traditional Jewish sign. Obviously the 10 Commandments prevents the representation or symbolic imaging of God himself. No
Right.
idol worship of any kind. So any symbolic representation of God, unlike other pagan religions, which had images of their gods and goddesses all the time,
Right.
Jewish places of worship, Jewish coinage, would not engage in graven images. So you'd have temple imagery like menorahs, tables, that kind of thing, but you'd maybe palm trees to locate you geographically, but no images of God. But zodiac symbols throughout ancient synagogues are quite common.
This is really good because I'm seeing with some of the stuff we're on a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I like that because I like how I knew this was going to go in a lot of different directions. I love how this stuff goes back to so many different aspects. And before the program, we were talking about how you really have to be willing to study a lot of different aspects. There is, and I'm creating kind of a master list, so to speak, of things that I want to go through before I feel like I'm even remotely educated enough to speak to it. But you can't speak about this stuff unless you've studied astrotheology, even if you're not as concluding some of the things like that you would see in Zeitgeist. There's still an element of this that's for sure there. And the mystery cults, all the of course ancient religions, including things relating to Greek and Romans, especially, where they're just what's coming right up into that time frame. Studying the mimesis, studying all the I've been learning recently about the Jewish numerology and gematria, how that's woven in. That's blown me away.
Well,
And
Hebrews and Greeks had this amazing system of letters to numbers, a little different, but they had a whole number code that was built into their alphabet.
Yeah, and that's stuff that, I'm jumping ahead here to what we'll get to later, but to be honest, when I look at all that stuff, as amazing as it is on the sense of I'm learning it now, there's also a sense of why wasn't I, as a Christian, raised in a Christian environment. I went to Bible college, a very good evangelical Bible college. No one mentioned any of this stuff. They never tell you that, for example, the Dennis MacDonald stuff, the Greek epics are woven all throughout the Gospels. I even was reading recently about how there's a bunch of verses just in the epistles that are straight up quotes from Plato and Socrates. I'm like, why does the God of the universe, who's got infinite wisdom, need to be quoting Plato all over the place? But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. But before we dive too much deeper into any of those things, I do want to ask you a little bit more about just your background. Could you go back to your religious background growing up? I think you said you grew up in a Presbyterian environment.
Yes, my parents were actually philosophically kind of different in a lot of ways. My mother's family were very religious. Her grandmother, both my parents were raised by single moms. And so my grandmother on my father's side and my great-grandmother on my mother's side had tremendous influence over me too. They were my babysitters and caregivers, as my secondary to my parents growing up, although I had both.
And all Christians. All Christians.
No. That's the significant difference. My father's family, they were, let me put it this way, they were country club conservatives in their politics, but they were atheists and agnostics, all of them. They were university educated. They sort of had this skepticism about any religion or any mystical idea. My grandmother was very polite. She could be polite in any religious company, but then when you get her alone privately, she's like, it's all nonsense, Jimmy. It's just all nonsense. And even when I was a Christian, but you'd really have to drag it out of her. She was the religious skeptic. She had a degree in comparative religion. She was in the first go-ed class of Stanford. So she was a smart lady. She knew multiple languages. And so she came from a conservative sort of, they had money, but she was an atheist. My mother's family, all of them Labor Democrats, but they were all of them some form of fundamentalist Christian. You love the story about my mother's grandmother. She actually was part of the Amy Temple McPherson Angelus Temple, the founder of Foursquare. She was one of these, really the mother of Foursquare religion, right? She was one of the leading Pentecostal evangelists of the 20th century. Very controversial. right? Maybe they've done movies. I think Faye Dunaway played her in the movie version, but she was a she Messiah and the founder of Pentecostalism certainly in its popular form in the 20th century. And my great grandmother went to her college, worked for her, knew her, was there at Angelus Temple in Los Angeles when she built one of the first mega churches in America, really. She got disillusioned with the Amy McPherson Foursquare movement, but she remained a Bible-thumping Christian to the day she died. And she read the Bible every day. And she was a huge influence on me because she was just a wise, smart lady. And being my great-grandmother, I venerated her. And so when I was a kid, she really was part of why I became really a Bible-thumping Protestant myself.
So she was part of your teaching in a very real way as a child?
Yeah, so I sort of had I had a grandmother on one side who was whispering, it's all nonsense, I don't believe a word of it. Keep an open mind, don't let them suck you in. Versus a great-grandmother who said, every word in the Bible is inerrant, and I'm waiting for the rapture. So those were the two sides kind of that I had. So my parents got together. It's absolutely remarkable. My mother was a political liberal, Bobby Kennedy, she supported in the 60s. My dad was a political conservative, Barry Goldwater. But when they came together, it was a really interesting combo. They took their kids like me to church, not because of the metaphysical considerations of religion, but because they thought that was the only place that their kids could get a moral education. How do I teach my kids right and wrong? And so this guy who was the swimming coach at the country club that my dad's family owned was a Protestant minister. And so he said, come to my Presbyterian church near downtown LA. And it was a liberal Presbyterian church. It really was. But my mother is, classic California ecumenical. I'll tell you the story. You're going to love it. The day that my parents got married and set up their first home together, my dad comes home from work that first night. And on the table in their bedroom, he sees a statue of Buddha, a portrait of Jesus, and a photograph of himself, all on the same dresser top. He turns to my mother and he says, there can only be one God in this house. You can choose. It's up to you. But there can only be one God in the house. And my dad
hopefully she chose wisely.
According to both my parents, my father's picture was the only one that remained.
Oh, that's awesome.
But my mother had this sort of idea that, all religions sort of get at the same fundamental truth. They're all sort of zeroing in on the basic same idea. And so she was ecumenical in the broadest sense possible. My father was an electronics engineer, a computer scientist. And so he was very science and reality bound. And but both of them thought it was a good idea to take their kids to church. And my dad, with all even his skeptical mother and his scientific background, he taught Sunday school.
Wow.
And really remarkable, huh? And so if that was what was important, then that was really the important truth in life. So I got into it as a kid.
You mentioned it was for, in large part, it's the sake of giving you a moral education. Did you get this sense as you grew up and kind of, read the Bible or understood theology more for yourself that they were looking at their religion in the literal sense of there's a God, his name is Yahweh, he has a son named Jesus, you are deserving of punishment for your sins and falling short of his glory. Thus, you need a substitutionary, atonement through Jesus. Was that, the kind of leading into the gospel story, was that part and parcel of what they brought up, meaning you need to believe in Jesus?
My parents really didn't give two hoots for the actual salvation concept within Christianity so much. But that is exactly the issue. I mean, I'd come back with questions like, right, it would be wrong for me to steal or kill or lie. The 10 Commandments says don't commit perjury, don't commit adultery, don't, kill people. So, okay, violence and dishonesty are wrong. But why? Is it because I'm obeying God? Because if I have to obey God, well, God told Abraham to go kill a child, his son Isaac. So if God tells me to murder children, is that okay? Is it because God says so that it's good? Or is God saying so because it's good? In other words, is God referring to some objective standard outside of himself? But of course, that creates a theological problem.
Yeah.
Is God simply complying with the morality that's independent and above God? Or is God say so, whatever it say so? So
Yeah.
that created philosophical issues very early for
Hmm.
me. And my parents, frankly, did not have satisfactory answers because they really didn't
bet.
buy the metaphysical arguments underlying, original sin and our need for salvation, man's inherent corruption, and that's why the sacrifice of Christ is our only means of redemption. They didn't really buy into the metaphysical scheme. They bought into the, no, you should be honest and not steal and not be violent and be a good person.
What, what was
Yeah,
it
but when
like?
I
Like
went to
when you were,
church, I adopted that.
okay.
I was the one who, for a time, brought to them, no, we are in need of salvation, and we need to spread the gospel because everyone needs to be saved.
Okay, that was gonna be my question. Is what was your response to it? So you kind of went beyond their lower level spiritual commitment and understanding, and you took it to a more conservative, traditional, orthodox, perhaps literalist position that we literally need to trust Christ, basically turn or burn.
I admit I was a young kid at the time, but yeah, I was a fundamentalist.
And
I
did your
believed that
parents?
every word was inerrant, and my parents were, my dad especially, especially when it came to like creations and the big miracles that Moses. Dad would always say, "You don't really believe," you
Were
know,
they
right?
were they at all concerned in the sense of thinking, this is getting mythology or superstition is getting a little bit too close to home here? Or were they like, it's his path, we'll let him do what he wants? How did they respond to that?
Very much the second way.
Okay.
I could almost remember the quiet whispered conversations behind my back that were, let him go through this, let him find his own way, let him discover things on his own. Who knows where his journey will lead? And we have to encourage, and that's what they did.
That's
My
interesting.
parents were, the most important decision we make is a decision we never make, who our parents are. And I am lucky enough to have had parents who let their kids find their own way. And they encouraged philosophical conversation around the dinner table. And they expected you to have an adult, serious answer. And they would treat you sort of like an adult if you didn't know what you were talking about. And so the conversation level, even as kids, we had to really step up our game, or dad and mom would say, hey, didn't you, people, Einstein said this, or Darwin said that. And they literally had enough background information to keep some elevation to the conversation. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, I went through that period where I was for sure fundamentalist, because this has got to be the way it is. And there were certain things that I think were broader moral ideas that my parents imbued me with that really were the crack for me when it did come. I would read something like John 3:16, John 3:17, perhaps the most famous passages in the New Testament for Protestants. And God loved the world so much, he gave his son to redeem us. Those who believe are saved. Read a little further. Those who don't believe are condemned. Already condemned, it says in John, right there in that passage. And that bothered me. I said, wait a minute, belief, what I hold to be true personally, is shouldn't be a matter of threats. Shouldn't be a matter of go to hell or you believe or go to hell. that was some kind of mental extortion. And that bothered me. My dad always said, go by your own judgment, look, read, consider what everyone, then come to your own decision. And I thought to myself, yeah, going by my own best judgment is the only chance I have of getting to the truth or close to the truth. Someone putting a gun to my head and saying believe or else is definitely the wrong way to believe anything at all. And so that just was starting to get under my skin in a real way. Is that what this is based on? The belief isn't a question of my own best rational judgment. It's a question of threats and coercion.
Yeah.
And the other thing, someone asked the question, aren't you really just talking to yourself in your own head? And I guess as a young man, I began to really wake up and consciously experience myself and think of myself, oh yeah, when I have that thought, it's really me. It's my subconscious. It's my emotion, to distinguish the operations of my consciousness from the rest of the world. And that had a huge impact. So that one day I was literally on my knees praying in my bedroom, literally on my knees praying in my bedroom. And it just struck me, I could be just talking to myself here, because whatever I have ever read into the meaning of this, it's always come from me.
Do you remember about what age you were when that struck you?
12
Wow.
and a half, almost 13. It was the summer I was going to turn 13. And it was, I remember it that way because in 7th grade, everyone called me, what did they call me? Bible man. That was what the kids called me. Oh, here comes Bible man. 8th grade, I suddenly shut up. Where's Bible man? Bible man's not talking about Jesus anymore. So, and then there came a point where I had to come clean with all my friends and teachers and family. And I think I don't believe in any of it anymore.
That was my question. Overnight. So that's about the age when you started to step back out of it. Okay. Did you ever get pulled back in at that point? Or was that it?
No, I was never really tempted to go back in. There were a couple of moments. I think there were a couple of moments where the same mindset crept in, where I could see, that was the mistake I made then, or that was the mistake I made then. I began to self-consciously study philosophy. I started at university when I was 16, and I was at NYU already studying history and philosophy when I was 18. And when I began and my focus, because I knew I wanted to be a lawyer, was on logic, was on forensics and epistemology. And though that became the iron wall, because then I began to realize, look, any belief, if an idea pops into my head, unicorn, elf, that does not oblige reality to contain unicorns and elves, and that I have to connect the idea in my head to the hypothesis by a process of demonstration. And that the only kind of demonstration that would work would be, and this is the other one that did it, knowing requires a method. And that's what philosophy really taught me. In other words, observation works because my senses actually physically connect me with reality. Logic works because it keeps my thoughts consistent. So my tie to reality and keeping tied to reality depend on observation and logic. And I saw how those connect to reality. But ESP, Ouija boards, tea leaves, astrology, horoscopes, mystic revelations, crystal balls, I could go on forever. These are all substitutes for the causal means of knowledge that is required. It's sort of the abracadabra that substitutes what we all really know that we need to know somehow. And it's the how. So I began to realize there's no magical knowledge, and that to believe in something, that something exists, is what requires the burden of proof. And that if you have an extraordinary claim like God, you're going to have extraordinary proof for God. And so I think that after I learned the basics of logic, I never looked back at religion, really.
Can I ask on that note, this is something I wanted to get into later anyway, so this is a really good segue. As you're looking at this issue of the logic, the need for extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims, you look at that and you obviously, in my words, you escaped the superstitious viewpoint, the mythological viewpoint, the viewpoint where rationality is not as important, that faith, even blind faith is the virtue, not doubt. You obviously got out of that early, and my experience was very opposite. I would say more indoctrinated, although very gladly pursuing it. Like you said, you got into it, you became the Bible man. I got into it on the same level, but I was all in. I put all my chips on that that number, and it was in such a way where when you insulate people, I think, enough, where there is no grandmother who is whispering in your ear, think twice, this isn't real. There isn't anyone saying this is important for your morality, but it's not necessarily something to take that seriously. You take all those out of the equation, and the only people you have in your circle, the only people, other people that say this is absolutely eternally life and death real in every sense. There's nothing about this that is fake. And it isn't even like presented as there's an option. I mean, occasionally you hear a preacher bring up atheism or just general casual Christianity and oppose it and say, we're, the atheists are the bad people, but we're God believers. But apart from an occasional sermon like that, it's always, this is real. This is in every sense the truth of our ultimate reality.
And drop dead serious.
Drop dead serious in every way. And
right.
And yet you escaped very early. And I'm curious for a couple questions, but my first question on it would be, do you think there's certain personalities that tend to get sucked in more? In other words, it took me to the age of 43 with what I would consider very solid education, including religious, but a solid education in general. But it wasn't until, maybe 42 before I really started to take it seriously that this might be wrong. And at age 43, I finally escaped. And yet someone else would say, nah, I didn't really. I think if I'm remembering correctly, Acharya, in one of her interviews, she said something like she was turned off by it at 7 or 8. She's like, I couldn't wait to get out of church. I might be misremembering that, but something like that. And it was this sense of like, this doesn't sound right. And yet to me, it did sound right for so long. Do you think certain personalities tend to be more like that? Or do you think it's more about just, if you get insulated enough, it doesn't matter what your personality is, they're going to get you?
Some of the best people are still religious. And I say that as an atheist. And I say that because I believe in the importance and inescapable necessity of philosophy. Philosophy is a human need. We, as human beings, have a different kind of consciousness than other animals. That's why we do art and science, and we play golf on the moon and write symphonies. We make long-term projections into the future in ways and with alternative possibilities that animals don't explore. And that unique form of consciousness, I believe, evolved naturally as a tool of survival. But on the other hand, humanity itself is still in a stage of sort of growing up intellectually. The reason why I would say that a lot of the best people are religious is because they are philosophical. Morality matters. Questions to philosophical questions, the answers to philosophical questions matter. So some of the most thoughtful and philosophical people remain religious for quite a long time. To them, they perceive the importance of philosophy in general. And I would say the persistence of religion is just that. Humans need a philosophical context. They need an ethics. They need to understand why they need an ethics. They need to understand their place in the universe. And religion provides all of that and a foundation for that, and sort of provides them with pre-canned answers that work a lot of the time, that give them, in most cases, a workable answer. Don't lie, don't steal, So there's a lot of moral truth to most religion. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been a lasting truth, I think, within those cultures. But on the other hand, real moral development, I believe, requires abandoning the metaphysics of God. I covered it a little earlier. Is it really just obeying God? Or is God himself having to be moral? And if so, what is the objective basis of morality that God would be looking to say, don't kill children? So people will often ask me, what is the moral grounding for you atheists? Because you obviously can have no absolute or objective moral grounding, right? Or consistent moral grounding. And I immediately turn back. So obeying the whims of God is objective? You're telling me that executions for blasphemy and for sex crimes, which is what the Mosaic Law prescribes, are moral, and that we don't learn or grow morally? I mean, slavery was only legally removed in the civilized world, 160 years ago? So human beings morally grow, and our knowledge does advance. I mean, if you'd gone in a time machine 300 years ago and asked people about the future of serfdom and slavery, they'd say, it's inevitable, it's natural, we'll always have. Just like today, they'll say, we'll always have religion. But I believe that human progress is possible, even on big things like that. And moral progress, if it's really going to happen, does need to abandon the metaphysics of religion.
Yeah.
One of the great problems I find with the new atheists, the Richard Dawkins, the Sam Harrises, they have not adequately, in my view, provided a sound secular basis for morality. Until and unless the atheist community does that, I believe religion will continue to persist. You know, David Hume, the English philosopher, Scottish philosopher, who lived in the 1700s, he devastated the arguments for God that had been made by the medieval scholastics, and they've never recovered. It's not like people believe that there's a logic, you know, serious philosophers or scientists believe, oh yeah, there's a logical necessity to believe in God. No, I honestly believe that just as my parents thought this was the only way to teach morality, that's what's the persistence of religion. And it will continue to persist so long as people think that that's the only objective grounding for morality, because morality is necessary. You know, we do need to habituate good character in our children, and it does make a difference to society. So in that sense, I believe in morality and the power of morality that will continue to influence people and keep religion going until secular thinkers develop a better basis for morality.
Yeah, which I honestly, it's one of those topics that I have not focused on as much, but I feel like it's like coming to the top of the list. I've been much more focused on just the question of where did this whole religion start from? Because it's kind of like it's like if you're in a stadium, you know, playing soccer, and someone's saying, well, there's a bunch of different teams playing, which team do you want to be on? And you as an atheist, you're saying, I'm not picking a team anymore. I'm not playing anything. I'm walking out of the stadium.
I don't want to play your game.
Yeah,
right?
I'm not playing this game anymore. But then you kind of have to be like, okay, well, now that I'm out of the stadium, I have to build, you know, certain constructs to make sense of the world. And it is true. And two quick thoughts I was going to make about this, and I'd love to hear your feedback. I've been fascinated by, number one, my own personal lack of really, when I was a Christian, acknowledging the horribleness of the morality and really the psychopathic persona of God. I was remembering recently this whole idea of if a man raped a woman, in some circumstances, he could just pay a little bit of money, and she has to become his wife, and she can never leave him. Like what woman who just got raped would want that? And yet that's encoded in the law. The idea of the slavery, but not just that you can have slaves, but you can bequeath them to your children, and you can also beat them, presumably, not that it's prescribed, but just in terms of permissiveness, you can beat them almost to a pulp, and as long as they get back up off the ground within 2 days, you don't get punished at all. And I'm fascinated by the fact that I'm sure I read that. I know I've read the Bible through many times, several dozen times. And at one point I literally even copied it. Like I wanted to be like, I want to make sure, this is how hardcore I was. I wanted to make sure that I had read every word of it. And right. I could type at the time about 100 words a minute. I probably slowed down since then. And I would literally just stare at the Bible over here, and I would copy it. And as I'm copying it, I would literally, like, if I had some thought about something I'd learned from a sermon, I would put a little note on the side, but I'd primarily just keep going. And I just copy the whole Bible, so not by physical hand, but by typing. And so I know I read these verses, I had to. And yet when you step back from it, you're like, why didn't that offend me? Like, why didn't that cause concern? And it almost became a double whammy of, when you realize, and Matt Dillahunty was really good at in terms of, he was one of several influences that really helped me think through this as I was, beginning to get close to escaping. But he was like, your God is so supposedly amazing, and yet he tells you don't eat shrimp, don't eat whatever shellfish, whatever the word is, but you can have slaves. Like, why can't your God just say, don't own people?
If God is this eternal source of wisdom, it was so important to forbid shellfish in kosher diet. On the other hand, he couldn't say slavery was wrong.
Yeah.
Okay. This guy says if someone utters the name of God out loud, stone him to death. Unless it's the high priest on Yom Kippur, right?
Mhm.
Otherwise, you get stoned to death just for uttering or misusing the name of God. Whereas, pick something else. That guy gets stoned, but you couldn't. You have to.
Yeah, not weave two tons of fabric together.
Exactly,
It's
exactly.
crazy.
All these really weird particular laws that are in there. Or one thing that always hit me too, and it even hit me at the time. Saul was commanded by God through the prophet Samuel to wipe out the Amalekites, and not just to wipe out the Amalekites, but the women and the children and even the farm animals. Saul spares some of the animals. Samuel, the prophet, comes by. What's that? The tinkling of bells that I hear? You killed the women and the children and the slaves, and that was great, but you left some of the animals. Therefore, Saul, the kingdom will be taken from you, and I'm going to make David the king. That's how David displaces Saul in Samuel in God's eyes. He didn't completely annihilate in his genocide the children and the animals of the Amalekites. And so God really wanted to kill all the children and the animals too, like they could have deserved it. That bugged me.
And if you remember too, I think in that verse, if I'm not mixing passages up, he actually goes, and it was, I believe, the king was named Agag, and I believe it says he literally hacks him to pieces in front of everybody. And it's
so
staggering.
Brutal. Yeah.
I remember. Do you know the name John MacArthur?
Yeah.
He's a pastor. He's gotten in the news recently because he wouldn't shut his church for COVID. But
Correct.
I was under his tutelage, so to speak, through radio programs and books. I've listened to some of his sermons dozens of times, like individual sermons dozens of times. And he went through a whole series when I was a young teenager on the lordship of Christ, meaning you had this niche of Christians saying, you just trust Jesus. And John MacArthur saying, no, you trust Jesus as your Savior, but in that transaction, it's implicit that He is now your Lord. He's your Savior. It's not trust Jesus, but do your own thing. It's trust Jesus and bow your knee in submission to your God. And so I listened to that series of sermons dozens of times. All of his books, I loved it. I ate them up, and I remember distinctly a sermon, and as well as it was a chapter in his book called "Hacking Agag to Pieces," and it was about he used it metaphorically to talk about you need to hack the sin in your life to pieces metaphorically. But I remember, like, I've heard that story. He, in a genocidal sense, he genocided, he hacked him to pieces. Why was that not a problem? And the other question I was going to ask for your response to is, I'm getting this sense that a lot of Christians have bought into this idea of progressive revelation. Like why was slavery okay? Why was genocide okay? And it's like, well, God had to reveal to them what they could take at that time. And it's like, I'm sorry, but I won't use expletives on my show, but I'm sorry, but you know what that is? That's beep. It's like, that is not.
So God who made us is the one who has to spoon feed us in the time. God couldn't have made us better earlier so that we could have. And by the way, shellfish was more important than slavery.
Yeah.
You see, that makes no sense to me, whatever. Yeah. See, what's really happening is that they're crediting the human achievement, the human moral development to God. They still have to, well, yes, since we didn't get the absolute truth about morality or science from the Hebrew scripture, God is really just updating us as we can take it at our speed, as they say with the computers. Well, that just makes very, very little sense. So we're going to have thousands of years of slavery, thousands of years. Think of just Christian history. I think for people to really do horrible things, they have to think they're doing a moral thing most of the time. Yes, there are bad people who on purpose do things, but I think they're a small minority. I think most people, when they do horrific things, really think they're doing a good thing. So when Christians, for example, during the Inquisition, literally put heretics, in Spain, when the Christians reconquered the Iberian Peninsula, right, finishing it up in 1492, kicking out the Moors of Granada, they imposed in the same year an Inquisition so that all the Muslims and Jews who still lived in Spain following the Christian Reconquista would be converted over. And if you wouldn't become a Christian, we're going to put you on the rack, we're going to torture you, and if you don't come along, we'll burn you. And we're going to do all those things out of Christian love. Because after all, your immortal soul is way more important than this little life here on earth. And so if we can torture you into thinking the right way, or burn your body so it doesn't have to be burned later on, we're doing you a huge favor.
Yeah.
It was love which motivated the Inquisitions. It was love which motivated and think about it. I mean, just take like the 30 Years' War in Germany in the 1600s. Catholics on one side, Protestants on another. Two variant Christians, two variant Trinitarian Christians, both culturally German, at each other's throats brutally, inventing new torture devices with which to torture each other. And here they are, sincere Christians. Absolutely. And so you say to yourself, how do two groups of such closely related, culturally related, Trinitarian Christians torture brutally each other? The clergymen on each side, women on each side. How could they stomach the torturing of the burnings? They were doing it out of conviction, out of moral certitude. We're doing the right thing. We're doing it out of love. The truths that we come to, I realized in my study of history, really make a difference. And I took to heart one of my atheist, or at least religious skeptical forebears, Voltaire. He said, if they can make you believe absurdities, they can make you commit atrocities. And this is particularly true. You'll notice that jihadists today, they commit suicide by running airplanes into skyscrapers. How can you explain that but some sort of mystical sense of righteousness?
Yeah.
The murder of thousands of innocent people, including other Muslims, doesn't even faze them. They'll commit suicide. Healthy young men commit suicide. It doesn't even faze them. It must be some insidious mistake in philosophy that goes way down deep, that makes them think they're doing the right thing. And so much of the worst atrocities in human history were done by people who thought they were doing the morally right thing. Sometimes I think that's what basically motivates the worst moments in human history.
Yeah. Well, it's been interesting to me, too, to reflect on how a lot of current Christianity has gotten away from, obviously, that stuff like that would be, illegal to do this kind of persecutions today. But it's gotten away even from the strong core message to a point where they've almost taken the hardcore Jesus out of it. Like, I don't know what, I'm not speaking to every church here, but there's a lot of churches that would follow the whole Bill Hybels, Willow Creek kind of, seeker sensitive, touchy-feely model. And there's a lot I've admittedly been to some of them. And you get the sense it's just, grace upon grace. I just feel the forgiveness. I feel the hope and the glory. And it's very low key. You don't get very offended. You get offended maybe once every 3 years by a sermon. It's just Jesus wants to help you get through your day. He wants to help you take the wheel.
Yeah, exactly. It's more like Jesus' psychotherapy in a new age.
Exactly.
Right. And he sort of helps comfort us and guide us through and lets us know that we have purpose and that we are doing the right thing.
But I almost feel like at times like the whole question that I have, which has been on my mind for almost every minute of the day, it feels like, and sometimes all night, of where did this come from? And, was Jesus real? Was there a guy at the beginning? It's almost like in some ways, as much as that's so critical to me, because I was very much into it, it almost seems like it becomes less important to certain people. What I mean is, here's an example. I've got a friend who I honestly he's not involved in these discussions at all. He's just a friend. But I asked him, so I know he goes to church, and I said, would you call yourself a Christian? And I was just curious where he stood with things. And he said, well, yeah, absolutely, I'm a Christian. And I said, so just to be clear, because you got to be clear on terms, does that mean you believe, the core Orthodox belief, Jesus was the Son of God, Savior? And he's like, oh, no. I'm just, I believe in his teachings. I follow his teachings. I'm a Christian since I follow his teachings. And it's almost like it doesn't, like when you gut it enough, it doesn't even matter if he's real anymore.
See, like I was saying earlier, Hume's logical refutation of all of Thomas Aquinas's logical attempts to prove God could go down, and it's not going to affect one way or another. There's whole other reasons, moral and psychological.
Yeah.
That's where the battle is, not in the, is it logically provable? Is this epistemologically correct? No. That argument is long gone. The question is, should people believe for altogether different reasons? Is it necessary psychologically? Is it necessary morally?
Yeah.
Around our ethics. That is why I regard philosophy as the single most important topic. It really does govern our lives. And the premises that we accept philosophically will govern, being the broadest, the cover the most ground, they will have the biggest impact on our lives. That's why I think we really have to get to the ethical and psychological components before we really change. You know, Christianity is an amazingly adaptive religion. And over the better part of the last 2,000 years, it has substantially changed. In the Gospels, Jesus could not be more clear about, say, individual violence. Submit to the evildoer, turn the other cheek, turn the other cheek. You can't run away. You can't block the punch. You certainly can't fight back, even if that's your only way out. You have to stand there and say, give it to me again, buddy. Right? Submit to the evildoer, turn the other cheek, pick up your cross and follow me if necessary. Don't worry about this world. It's the next world that matters. And over and over, we get this idea. St. Augustine, writing around the year 400, said, no, a Christian cannot kill in self-defense. Even if a maniac is coming at you with a knife, it would be pure self-love. Why are you loving yourself over the guy who's coming at you with a knife? You've got to sit there and take it. He said, of course, most people will fight back, but that's a sin. They should turn the other cheek. So during the Middle Ages, Christians were in a desperate plight. Christian kings would go to the Pope and say, can I even go to war? And the Pope would say, you can only go to war under certain very limited circumstances. And even so, it's a sin, and you still have to get, have to go to confession, do penance, and all the Catholic stuff. It was only in the 13th century, it was only with Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s that Thomas Aquinas, not using Jesus at all, because Jesus was perfectly clear on the topic, he went to Aristotle and natural observations of animals and other societies and Aristotelian Greek logic, pagan Greek logic. He said, self-defense is perfectly natural, and and as long as it's reasonable, and you didn't kill out of revenge or self-love or something, it really was just to protect yourself or someone else, it's okay. Christian clergy, monks and nuns, they still had to turn the other cheek and take it when they were attacked. But Christian laity, after Thomas Aquinas, if you were to tell Christians today, look, it's only been the last 700 years that self-defense was morally available to you as a Christian, their minds would be blown. That's how big Christianity has changed. In the last 600 years, it's assumed by most Christians, well, sure, reasonable self. If they attack you, you can push back. Yep. But wait, I didn't miss the little asterisks when Jesus said, turn the other cheek. I missed the exception when he said, submit to the evildoer. Yeah. Jesus was consistent. Blessed are the peacemakers. That's that.
We're getting close to your book at this point. Getting close to some of your
there are exceptions, right? The government, Paul says the government can wield the sword, and right. Jesus, of course, goes through the temple violently. So God and government maybe can do that, but it's pretty clear where the Amish and the Shakers and the Quakers get their pacifism from. Yeah. They are actually trying to adhere closer to what was the original understanding of Jesus's ethics. That's all. And so I began to question, because of things like that, I began to question the whole ethical scheme. So Christian ethics is really a mixed bag of moral, philosophical notions that come from pagan and secular philosophy, plus the words of Paul and Jesus. And you're sort of interpreting it as you go by mixing it where it's convenient. And once I saw that, then I saw, well, wait a minute here. Secular ethics, rational ethics should be the only ethics. That's basically how I developed.
As you get into that and all the other ramifications of atheism, I know you said you've been more of this mindset starting around age 8, but as you kind of cemented it as you're in your later teenage years and young adulthood, I would assume you got some pushback. Could you tell me a little bit about what that has looked like over the years, and has it changed since you've been more vocal? I mean, there's people that are probably more like what you might call closet atheists of, I don't go to church, but I'm not really going to talk about it. It's my business. You're kind of taking a significant platform and you write a book about it and you do interviews. What was it like at the beginning of your young adulthood, and has it changed as you've had the platform?
from the beginning, I knew that it would be controversial and would upset people. And because of my own personal experience, I know what religion means to people personally. In other words, if someone had come to me when I was a sincere Christian and said, everything you think is BS, and let me prove to you why your God is nonsense, and why your God in your Bible really isn't a very good guy, and how humans really need to get all that, I would have immediately pushed him back. You're just a jerk. You don't realize how important this is or what this means to me.
Right.
And so, for example, with my religious grandmother and great-grandmother, when I became an atheist, I wouldn't even have thought to offend. Why bother them? Why upset them?
Yeah.
There's no chance I'm really going to convert them. So I just avoided the topic with them. Certain Christians, people who were sort of my elders, that I sort of treated with respect and didn't want to hurt their feelings and didn't want to argue with them at all. If they weren't in that category, however, I treated them like I went, of course, and every time a young person finds a new idea, it takes over. For a while, I was a kind of a militant atheist, of course. And so anyone who wasn't my grandmother was going to get a lecture from me. And boy, you guys, yeah. And I realized that it was counterproductive, really, to go about it that way.
That's exactly where I am at right now. I'm learning to back it up a little bit. Yeah.
So I found that you have to wait for the right moment to really, a person has to come to a question on their own. And then you cannot really give your whole answer anyway.
Yeah.
And what I found to be far more effective in persuading people than anything else is wait for them to have a sincere question that starts opening the door to all this, and then just give them a taste. Well, isn't there an easier answer here? And just leave it there, walk away.
Yeah.
And if they want reading material, suggest a book to read. Let's face it, people really don't change their minds in arguments and conversations.
Yeah.
Their pride gets, you know what I mean? And besides, to do our real thinking, we need to be alone with ourselves and to ourselves. It's when we're reading and when we're alone thinking, that's when people are really doing the thinking that goes behind important beliefs. Yeah. And coming to decisions. And I think we all have to respect that. And we all have to respect everyone's own time when it becomes that moment when they can see it. Yeah. The other thing is to know why it is they believed what they believed, even if it was an error.
Yeah.
The first thing I do, instead of launching in now on a lecture of, 5 proofs of this, the God, or the metaphysics, no. What was important to you then? Why did that matter to you, and why was that personally persuasive? Understand that, and fully understand sympathetically why a person comes to their conclusion is absolutely the only way to ever really persuade someone.
Yeah, well, our discussions bring me back to a part of my life that's really related. I love to write. I've always loved to write. Even as a little kid in 5th grade, I wrote a 100-page science book. I loved to write. And it was quite the thing. I got even a little award in 5th grade. I wrote a book in 5th grade. But
see, it's the philosophical people who stay religious because you know the importance of ideas. Yes. And even then it was, no, I want to understand science. And that's the psychology, which is both, I think, a thing that keeps people in religion, but is also the way out.
Yes. And what happened with my love of writing is it obviously took more of a religious turn because that was my background. I went to a school in Pennsylvania called Lancaster Bible College to be a pastor. Got convinced to be that young men should not be pastors according to the Bible, and got more focused on missions. But in the meantime, I began to think about using my talents, quote unquote, for God's glory, and my love of writing. And so one of the things that I was writing, and I literally still have it, is it's like a 1,000-page manuscript about Christian worldview. And one of the major topics that I was studying, which it's ironic now, and you'll see why in a second, but it was the question of how does someone ever, if possible, how does someone ever radically change a worldview, or how do you shape it? And obviously you shape it primarily through childhood and indoctrination and so forth. But once you're indoctrinated, or just some kind of preset stage you're starting from, I was fascinated by the question of how does anyone ever shift? And the irony of it was my shift was in that book was the question of how do you shift from a very, the world is here, the world is now, it's all about me and pleasure and my temporal experience. How do you shift, how people shift from that to a more spiritual perspective where you see kind of like the Matrix, that when you see the code, it's like God's fingers are everywhere. How do you shift someone's worldview to see that? And little did I know that as much as I would have never dreamed it, that was a precursor to another question of how do you shift someone's worldview back out of that? If you've, and of course that wasn't on the radar at that point, but it fascinates me that there are several different ways, such as trauma. If you're, you say your parent dies out of, much younger than you would have thought, you get shaken up and it's like, oh wow, I got to rethink my life now. Trauma does it. Certainly someone's testimony of, oh, I was in this just like you, but now I'm this. Oh, wow, my good friend, their testimony is making me rethink stuff. But there's different ways that we see it. And
very frequently it's crisis in life.
Yes.
You look at all the, as a prosecutor, I was eager to help liberalize the treatment of drug laws and have non-incarceration alternatives for people who are simply addicts, and not dealers in drugs, but people who are just addicts. And so we put them into treatment programs and so forth. And very frequently, the experience of hitting bottom as a drug addict, you've lost your wife, you've lost your job, you've lost your home, your alcoholism or drug addiction has pretty much ruined your life, or your heroin addiction, you almost died in that last overdose, will get people to have this come to Jesus moment. I need to change my life or I will die. My life is being ruined by what I'm doing. Yeah. And so it's talk about the importance of ethics and psychology. Yeah. So it's in that crisis moment that people will very frequently say, a religious conversion helped me change my whole behavior. Mm. Human beings are creatures of habit. And we will continue, every time we do something, it's like we wear a groove into some soft metal, and that groove becomes the easier path, and it gets easier and easier and easier, and we're creatures of habit mostly. Yeah. And if we don't consciously work and think about what we're doing, we'll just do what we've always done, right? Yeah. And so to get out of bad habits that are causing us to be self-destructive, we need to somehow work at the philosophical level. It is really at that deep philosophical level where we need to say, I need to rethink everything. Now, what's really interesting is that I've seen it go both ways. Our friend Derek Lambert is a great example. His coming out of drug addiction actually meant the reverse. He had to get his own secular head together to really get a handle on it, that change in his life that he wanted. Yeah. But it's when we want to make important changes or when we face an important crisis in life, that'll often be the crossroads that force us to change there's a sort of a natural inertia or conservatism. I'll just keep believing what worked in the past or what seems to work for me psychologically until we need to change. Yeah. Until something confronts us with, geez, it's in front of me right now. So that is why, the development of moral character, there's a subject that atheists have left completely untouched, that Christian moralists and other religious moralists have developed quite extensively, that atheist secular philosophy could learn a whole lot from, right? It is the development of moral character and the correct habits, right? That creates what Aristotle called, we're born with our first nature, but we develop and create a second nature through our habits and our actions and our behavior. And that to actually do a fundamental change in that very frequently requires a fundamental change of philosophy. Yeah. And so you'll see, like Alcoholics Anonymous founder Bill W., right? What do they start with? They start with Reinhold Niebuhr, a 20th century Christian theologian, developed this Serenity Prayer, which is really a brilliant approach to ethics that I think atheists can use a great deal. God, grant me, right, the strength to change the things I can, the serenity to accept the things I can't change, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now, I don't care what your religious beliefs are. That's just universally true. if that's just the way things are, I was born a white man, at the time there's nothing I can do about that. You can't praise or blame people for that. We just, like a Buddhist, have to accept it and let it wash over us. On the other hand, if there is something I can do something about, if it is within my power of control, then get off my tail, darn it, and give me the courage to do at least that bit I can do.
Yeah.
Perhaps unlike a Buddhist. And then, of course, the wisdom to know which is which. What is the stuff I should just accept and not fight because it's nature? And what is the stuff, no, I could actually improve in the world, and especially in my own life. So, it is that sort of practical technology of ethics and psychology that secular ethics needs to develop. When they do, they'll no longer be in need of religion, because then we'll be able to get people through crises. Then we'll be able to start helping people make the important or sometimes rough decisions they need to make in their life, rather than falling back on, which is what a lot of people do, the religion they remember that mother and grandmother taught them. So if I've screwed up in the course of my life and I've become a drug addict and a thief or something, remember what mother or grandmother taught us. Get back to good old religion, because that's the only moral philosophy they're exposed to.
Yeah. Is that, if there were theoretically a book that were in the process of being written that you were asked to contribute to, is that of interest to you?
Yes, I am totally, I think that's really where the answer to even the history question lies. The ethics of Christianity in itself, the original ethics of the New Testament. Back up. When I studied history, everything in history, when we study history, we put into its cultural and political context. Right. The American Civil War, the plays of Shakespeare, whatever it is, will tell me what the culture and the politics of the time was. And when I understand that wider context, suddenly it makes sense. Suddenly, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice makes sense, or the American Revolution makes sense within its time, or the Civil War, because that's what the culture and the philosophy of the time, the dominant ideas, the economics, the politics of the time was leading to. And I guess what I thought to myself was, when I questioned Christian ethics, this turn the other cheek thing, this peace thing, is very radical. Where does it come from? And then I realized the first century had this war going on between Messianic militant Jews and Rome. And so this doctrine of pacifism and altruism was a radical doctrine of pacifism and altruism was emerging in that context. And I thought to myself, from the 30,000 foot elevation, that's no accident.
Yep.
The New Testament represents a critical response to the Jewish rebels of the first 2 centuries. And that, in effect, is what it is.
This might be a really good spot for me to give an intro to that, because I feel like I could take us into some other topics related to what we were talking about, but I do want to, I'll leave at least a little bit of time here at the end to talk about your book. And I would love to kind of do this, if we could, again, where we maybe talk through a couple issues and then dive into your book. And because I know you do a lot of interviews where you talk about the issues either in your book or ramifications related to it and other people's research. But I've been enjoying so far just kind of this back and forth of hearing your thoughts about just atheism and Christianity in general and society, because you have a lot of wisdom that goes beyond just the scholarship of the book. But let me give you a chance to tell us about your book here too, Creating Christ. Again, I forget if I mentioned that. If I didn't mention that earlier, that was my oversight. But the book we're talking about, although people probably see it in the great poster board there behind you, Creating Christ, and you co-wrote that with Warren Fahy. And then the other one that I see there is The Passion of Ayn Rand. Excuse me, I'm mispronouncing that. Ayn Rand's Critics. Is that?
It's really easy. The first, it's a tricky, is the name. Really, she invented that first name. So it's, okay. Don't be shy. Lots of people make that mistake, but it's pronounced Ayn, like Ayn, rhymes with pine or mine.
Okay.
A-Y-N, Ayn. She took it from a Finnish name of a writer she heard of, Aina. Okay. She was born in Russia, and she took an American name as a writer, and it is a funky name, Ayn Rand. But she is the controversial novelist and philosopher Ayn Rand, who she was one of those atheist thinkers that obviously as a teenager I started reading. I started reading Friedrich Nietzsche's critique of Christianity. It left a big impression. I started reading Ayn Rand and her very, very different approach to ethics than Christianity, and that left a huge impression on me. So my first book really was trying to understand Ayn Rand's life and ideas in context, based on other biographies that had been written about her.
Yeah. Well, I want to do a little bit more focus here in our time left on the Creating Christ book, but I would love at some point down the line just to do a video with you on the Ayn Rand's book,
Right.
just to hear more about that, because that's fascinating. And I'll do, before that, I'll definitely do some research, so I'm prepared for that. But that's interesting too. Before I talk about your Creating Christ book, which book did you find more fun to write and to research for?
The Christianity book, no doubt.
Yeah.
Much more fun. Ayn Rand, what I was doing was largely responding to critics, and doing so in a biographical way too. Now, there's nothing that I enjoy more than talking philosophy. So the Ayn Rand stuff is secular philosophy that I'm at home with as my own philosophy. So in one sense, that's a preferable topic, right? And it was an exciting experience. The estate of Ayn Rand, once they saw my initial essays that I posted online, the actual estate of Ayn Rand's heir, contacted me and offered me never before published material from Ayn Rand's private journals that related to my work.
Yeah.
And
Awesome.
Ayn Rand's heir actually said, "Could you use that?" Yeah. So in my book, I integrated material that you could find nowhere else from the famous author's pen.
That's
They
awesome.
opened the archives and all of her material to me, and it was fun in that sense. But it was sort of inside baseball within the objectivist world. Her philosophy is called objectivism. And so it had a very sort of niche sort of market. It was inside baseball even for that. So, but on the other hand, Christianity, I knew would have this huge, broad appeal to a lot of people. And I'd been working on it for so long. I also knew I had something much more creative to say in that area, that would be the real work of my life. As I continue to do books, they will be more on, for example, I want to understand objectivism from the perspective of Ayn Rand's philosophy. A thorough critique of both sides, or an interaction of both sides from the other, has never been undertaken. And I would very much like to do that.
So you have some more books coming.
I sure do. And more just on the history of Christian ideas, which I've been drenched in for the last 40 years. So
I look forward to that. Well, I wanted to do this. I want to read the description from I guess this is probably from Amazon about your book. But I wanted to ask for you to explain it with this pre-question in mind. This was something I was going to ask before, but I think it relates a lot to your book as we go into it. The question of changing someone's worldview, and this is just a very small precursor rabbit trail. I think we're both very good at rabbit trails, but I'll try to keep this very very tight to the story. One of the big questions that comes up is a lot of people just won't address the question of, what if I'm wrong? There's like this assumption of, I know there's alternative theories out there. Maybe some of them I've heard, some of them I haven't. But it really doesn't matter too much. I don't need to know too much more about any other religion or worldview or philosophy, or even about the origins of Christianity, because I know I've got the truth. And I know that I know that I know. But in that, and I know for myself, I truly can say, as much as I would have said technically at age 13 to 15, I recommitted my life to Christ. I made it my own. There was a very real sense at age 43 when I escaped. I realized I never, ever really thought legitimately, fully, maybe this isn't real. Maybe this is mythology. I mean, even the word mythologies, I would have just phrased it as maybe this isn't real. But to realize later, the truest sense of it, maybe this is mythology. It wasn't on the radar. So with that question in mind of how do you get someone to at least entertain the idea, if again, when the conversation's appropriate. Obviously, you said you wouldn't have said that to certain people in your family. You just knew that's not the conversation to have. But wanting to be open to saying when people are in the right mindset, to have that question of maybe there's something else going on here that I completely thought. So with that in mind, I want to introduce the book and then have you kind of talk about what's in it and what the response has been as people have either been willing to say maybe this is what's happening, or no, you're going to burn in hell, and that's not true. Christ is Christ. Christ is God. He's the Savior. So the book is again called Creating Christ. For over 30 years, authors James Valliant and C.W. Fahy painstakingly researched Christianity's mysterious origins. In the process, they formed a startling conclusion that was met at every turn by more and more compelling evidence. Their theory, and the irrefutable proof they have found supporting it over 3 decades, will utterly change the understanding of some of the most important historical forces that are shaping our world to this day. From the ancient texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls to the writings of Pliny the Elder, from Philo, Seneca, Pliny the Younger, Flavius Josephus, and the New Testament itself, to the astonishing new archaeological and iconographic evidence presented in Creating Christ for the first time, authors Valliant and Fahy present a theory of Christian origins that will astound all who read it. The implications for the modern world, which still finds itself locked in the same bitter conflict described in its pages, are sure to be far-reaching and profound. So could you tell us more about what is Creating Christ, who created Christ, and what is your book proposing?
The book proposes a theory. It's not in general terms new to us. It's actually been around since the 1800s and a guy named Bruno Bauer. But the idea is that, well, let's just start out with, like I said earlier, the basic history of the moment. In the 1st century, there was a giant religious war, apocalyptic, cataclysmic conflict between the Jewish people and the Roman Empire. It manifested in terrorism and violent disturbances throughout the century, but it broke into open warfare between 66 and 71, 73. That was the first Jewish war, and that was the war that reduced the second Jewish temple to the Wailing Wall that it is today. So it had a psychologically catastrophic impact on the religion of Judaism. Their one temple to their one God was reduced to a Wailing Wall. More than that, it may have taken up to 1 million lives. In the United States today, the Jewish population as a percentage is in the single digits. In the Roman world, it was between 10 and 15% of the population was Jewish, and they were scattered throughout the Eastern Roman Empire. And Judea was right on their border with one of their great Roman threats, the Parthians. And it was right up against their great food source, Egypt. So it was of great political importance to the Romans, too. It was vital that the Romans maintain control over that eastern province. And there was this religion-inspired war. The historians, both the Jewish and the pagan historians of the time, tell us that the motive for the war were the messianic prophecies in the Hebrew literature.
Right.
Without those messianic prophecies, there'd be no war. And the Messiah they were expecting was a political, military Messiah of the sort that Hebrew literature had experienced before, a Joshua, a David, someone to lead the Jews to political, military victory here on earth.
By the way, did they think of that Messiah as a demigod kind of figure?
No. Jewish mythology, religion is monotheistic,
right,
and strictly monotheistic by the time of Jesus, for sure.
Okay.
It may have evolved from polytheism centuries and centuries earlier, but by the time Judaism is returning from Babylon, 500 years before, 600 years before Christ, up to Jesus' time, they'd become strictly and sectarianly monotheistic. That's
so
why
the Messiah was political much more than a divine figure. Okay.
Precisely. And that was exactly the kind of Messiah that the rebels were expecting. And as the historian Josephus makes plain, all the rebel leaders were basically messianic claimants. They, like Joshua, would miraculously part the Jordan River, or they could, do other miraculous things which would show they were the Messiah. They were expecting an earthly Messiah. If the sectarian documents of the Dead Sea Scrolls are any indication, Orthodox Jews of this period were messianically fervent, militant, nationalist sectarians. And that's what really motivated the Jewish war. And when I looked into the messianic prophecies, the nature of Messiah as the Jews were expecting it at the time, it became clear to me that the New Testament represents specifically a critical response to those rebels, non-nationalist. But it kicks the door right open out of Jewish nationalism. Jewish exceptionalism takes a huge hit. Anyone can now come and be, and you don't even need to be circumcised. And it's really for the whole world, not just for Jews. So Jewish exceptionalism takes a hit. Jewish nationalism takes a hit. Militancy takes a hit with Jesus's call for peace. His praise of a centurion, his command to pay for taxes, pay your taxes, render unto Caesar. Suddenly, his friendship with tax collectors. Suddenly, in the context of the first century, the Gospels appeared to me to be a political response to the political actions of, but of course, 2,000 years ago, there was no separation between religion and politics.
Yeah.
Everything the Romans did had religious significance for the Romans. We have the gods. We need an explanation from the gods. We need to take auguries to make sure that the gods are on our side. That was the Jews. We have the one Almighty God. If we win, it's God favoring his chosen people. If we lose, how could it be God favoring those? We must have sinned against the one true God. Yep. And that's how they explained, for example, the Babylonian captivity. So they needed to have religious explanations. The sincere man on the street needed to have a religious explanation for the political crisis. And they were politically motivated, religiously motivated in the political crisis. So it struck me that the New Testament is a critical response to the Torah orthodox, nationalist, militant, messianic rebels of the first 2 centuries, pretty obviously.
So this may get us off course for a second, but just clarify, who came up with this idea in the first place? Do you think there was a guy at the beginning and they just, as he was being mythologized and legends were being added, that they just kind of took over the story, or were they the creators of the story?
Well, in my own personal history, even after I became an atheist, I assumed there was a historical Jesus, that there must have been this real guy, maybe a teacher in Galilee they exaggerated stories about and said he rose from the dead and he could calm the seas and, do all these other things that Jesus did. And those were just exaggerations because he later came to see him as a Messiah and a God.
Right.
Now, after doing all this research, I am I'm in that situation where I think more historians should be, or more scientific researchers should be, and just admit, I don't know when we don't know. Yeah. So in our book, Creating Christ, we studiously avoid the topic of whether or not there was a historical Jesus.
Okay.
It really doesn't matter so much. It's the Jesus of the New Testament that influenced history. Right. It's the Jesus of the New Testament that was the single biggest impact in European and American intellectual and spiritual history. And that's the figure we should study, right?
Yeah.
So on the other hand, if there was a historical Jesus, I've come to believe that he was probably very much unlike the hero of the Gospels. Yeah. Whether or not there was a historical Jesus, I don't know. Maybe I'm leaning a little bit in the historical direction these days, thinking he may have been a rebel. But again, I don't know. Maybe the Brand and Eisenman, these are 2 biblical scholars, the Brand and Eisenman thesis, recently popularized by Reza Aslan in his book Zealot. The idea that Jesus was somehow a political zealot is kind of tempting to me. The pacifist Jesus, I think, was a political creation for political reasons in an age of warfare. When I came to realize that we really don't know who wrote the Gospels, we really are unsure who Paul is.
Yeah.
So it's not so much, again, we can understand the Christ of the New Testament much better, I think, than we can understand what the historical reality of a Jesus was. Right. And I think that's where our focus should be. And I do not propose that the Roman emperor himself came up with it or something. There were plenty of high-ranking, wealthy, intellectual Jews who were very closely cooperating with the Romans at the time. When the Roman general Titus for example, sacked Jerusalem in fulfillment of Jesus' famous prophecy in the year 71 AD, he had at his side the Jewish priest and historian Flavius Josephus. He had at his side the nephew of the Jewish philosopher Philo, Tiberius Alexander, who was a Roman governor of both Judea and Egypt. He had at his side the Herodian king Herod Agrippa II and his sister Berenice, who Titus almost married at one point. So there were these wealthy, well-educated Jews who were looking, I think, for a way to be both good Romans and good Jews, which was not an easy thing at the time. The Jewish rebels, remember, were saying you can't be both. To be a good Jew, we have to rebel against Rome. And that's the whole point of the Jewish war.
Right.
So when Jesus comes along and says, no, render unto Caesar what's Caesar's, give to God what's God's, he's saying you can do both.
Yeah.
Just give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. We can be both a good subject of Caesar and a good Jewish worshiper of God. Precisely an answer to the militant rebels of the time, which seems to me, you know, Paul at Romans 13 says, obey the state as God's appointed agents on earth, no less than God's appointed. And he's talking about the Roman government in the time of Caligula and Nero.
Yeah. And that,
at the time of the Jewish war. So it struck me that the New Testament is Roman in its sensibilities, in that it is a statement of Messianic Jews who wanted to get along with Rome at the time. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's amazing to me that like when you just grow up in it, you don't think about it, but when you step back from it, and someone, especially when someone helps point it out, you're like, oh yeah, like for example, the anti-Semitism stuff that's in the Bible, in the New Testament. What, you know, when you're in it, you don't think about it. When someone points out to you that, you know, there's people arguing and certain positions or certain scriptures are very anti-Semitic, you're thinking, oh yeah, so if there were people that were really hated the Jews, I can see why they'd paint their gospel to be much more about the Jews did this, it's their fault, you know. And thus you get the, you know, the Martin Luther kind of people that are just so anti-Semitic for centuries afterwards, even to
Fie
this
on
day.
you dirty Jew, said Martin Luther.
Yeah.
Right? They killed Jesus.
Yeah, and it's like the same thing with this Roman. It's like you don't see it, but you see slaves obey your masters. The whole what is it? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's with the coin.
Oh, well, my favorite bit is in the Jewish gospel, Matthew, mind you. The Gospels, Matthew is considered the most Jewish oriented. And yet the crowd at the time of the trial of Pilate, they say, crucify him. And of course, they have to convince Pilate 3 times in all 4 Gospels. But in Matthew, he adds, his blood is on us and our children.
Yep.
Wow. In other words, the entire, as if they were speaking in unison, it's a fictional story. But imagine the Jews collectively then saying, it's our fault and it's going to be our punishment and on our children. Yeah. It's important to note, too, in the complexity of the era, there were extremely zealous Orthodox Jews who thought that the temple had grown corrupt.
Yeah.
There were, on the Roman side, plenty of Roman Republicans who thought Nero was a tyrant. So on both sides, you have Roman and Jewish, you've got different opinions. You've got Roman writers who are saying Nero was an SOB, and you've got Jewish writers saying, oh, the temple's so corrupt. And what Christianity sort of does is it takes advantage of all of those mixed opinions to sort of weave this tale that is designed, I think, to pacify Messianic Jews of the first 2 centuries.
Two questions that come to mind right away. Number one, as you looked at the extra biblical books, you know, I know there's over 40 different Gospels. There's at least 6 different books of Acts. Did you find anything that struck you that you recall off the top of your head that looked like that might have been going on in some other books, even though they didn't get included in the canon?
No, it's going on in all of them practically.
Really?
Now there's and with the canonical, it's really easy. I can basically extract 2 books from the canonical New Testament and then say all you've got there is Roman propaganda. Yeah. You know, and we would play a game for decades. My friends and I would play a game, and I would literally say, randomly pick a page in the New Testament, do this with your finger, go boom, drop your finger down on a verse, and I'll explain to you how it's Roman propaganda. And you can literally do that. Take the basic structure of the Passion narrative shared by all 4 Gospels. We know it to be fiction. There were no witnesses to the trial, right? Critical scholars have long since thought, hey, how do they know what was said back and forth since there's no witnesses?
Yeah.
And we really have no records. It's a fiction, and it's clearly a fiction, sort of a parabolic fiction, a parable as Jesus taught in parables. But what do we have? We have 12 disciples who represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus even says the 12 disciples will judge each of the 12. So that comparison is drawn out explicitly in the Gospels. So Judas, whose name even is synonymous with the tribe of Judah and the nation of Judea, he's the betrayer. His name might mean Sicarii, Iscariot, which is one of these rebel groups, right? And he betrays Jesus. But who are the people who want to get him? It's not the Romans. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus has been having these arguments, these rhetorical jousts with Pharisees, priests, scribes, every kind of Jewish authority out there. Jesus is arguing, and he's arguing over Torah. Disciples work on the Sabbath, or it's nothing you put into your body is impure. It's what comes out of your body. So in other words, he attacks kosher diet. He attacks Sabbath. He's Torah critical. He's pro-peace. He says, render unto Caesar. So these arguments reach a climax. Right. Jesus comes into Jerusalem. He predicts the destruction to come, a dire warning to the rebels. Do not rebel. Jerusalem is about to get wiped out within living memory. He even tells them that. He even tells them the temple's going to get, not a stone will be left on it, one on another. Okay? Literally, it's a dire warning against rebellion. Predicting the outcome, if you will, of the negative outcome of the Jewish war. That's what sets off the whole thing. Right. Jesus comes to the temple. He says he's critical of the temple like the extremists are, but he says something altogether different. It should be a house of prayer for all nations. The exact opposite of what the rebel nationalists would have thought. But right. So he's sort of morally justifying, if not physically commencing, the Roman destruction that would come 40 years later.
So
I'm sorry?
With people doing this with his story, in terms of the timing of it, would they have been doing this in a way that I don't know, we don't know. It's a little bit of there's a curtain of time because there's no books for a certain period of time. We don't know what was happening for a generation, which is in itself incriminating. But in that generation, where there's just nothing. Do you suspect
maybe Paul's authentic letters?
Yeah. But even those are at least it's at least like a close to a generation right after 30 AD. Right,
Paul. Well, let's assume that Jesus died between say 30 and 37 AD, which is depending on the gospel, we'd go on his birth.
If there was a guy.
Right. Matthew puts it in 4 BC. Luke puts it more like 6 or 7 AD. The birth of Jesus. So we'll give it a range. since the nativity gospel writers can't agree on when Jesus was born, let's give it the range between say 30 and 36 or 7. Between that and the destruction of the temple is almost 40 years.
Right.
And in that time, the only real Christian literature that survives could be the 7 authentic Pauline letters, which were probably written in the 50s, sort of right in between Jesus' alleged mission and the Jewish war. But right after the militant Jewish disturbances in Rome in the 40s, which caused Claudius to expel the Jews because of messianic disturbances, but before the outbreak of the actual Jewish war. That's the period in which Paul is on the eve of the Jewish war, in other words.
I guess my first question, and this is more in line with the background of I've been doing a lot of studying of the mythicist side of it. Do you think that the original people were being written to as people that probably knew, like, yes, we did see that guy. There was a man, his name was Jesus. He was crucified, and either I saw it or I heard of it, or, at least my dad did. I've got a firsthand account of it. Or in the sense that those people would have said, yes, I know who you're talking about, and I know that the story is meant to be taken somewhat literally. Or are we talking about this where the people would have said, we already know that didn't happen. We know that wasn't real. There's a deeper meaning to this, and we get the deeper meaning. Because just a side example, I'm starting to study, again, enough to be dangerous, the Pythagoras influence, the numerology, the 153 fish in John 21. And, you get the sense that there's some hidden messages. And I was reading recently about
Why are
how,
we given so many specific numbers?
yeah,
The numbers of people at the here, the number of people on Paul's shipwreck, the
yeah,
number of loaves of bread, the number of, why are we given all these weird numbers?
yeah.
Numbers.
And why are so many of them so related to the Iliad and the Odyssey? But that's a different topic.
Ah, yes,
But like,
exactly.
do
Why
you,
do so many plug into other, like Hellenistic or Greek literature?
yeah. But like,
Absolutely correct.
do you think that the original people were like, we know this story isn't real. Like there's no question. We get that this is a parable, this is a metaphor. Or do you think some of them just from day one thought, you know what, I wasn't there, but it sounds like you're telling me about something that happened, 10 miles down the road. I have no reason to disbelieve that it actually happened. I think this is a literal story. Like, how do you think they took it at first?
I believe that, well, first let me start out with that disappointing thing I tell you about. I don't really know. And I think that the fair answer to the full question is, I don't know.
Sure.
From the way it appears, if we accept the standard Pauline dating of at least the 7 believed to be authentic Pauline letters, Paul at one point has this wonderful sort of ritual assertion, liturgical assertion. Jesus was crucified and he appeared to, and he gives a list of appearances to the 12 and to Cephas, and then finally he says to himself, and to me is one unborn untimely. Now, the implication is that Paul has only had connection with Jesus through his mystical visions.
Right.
So there was this guy who was crucified, but then there were these visions that really appear to be the big thing that mattered. These post-resurrection appearances to Cephas and the 12 and to him. So are Christians getting their theology from mystical visions of a risen Christ? And what does that mean? Was there a dude who was actually crucified? If there was a dude who was crucified by the Romans, he was not crucified for saying, pay your taxes and be a peacemaker. He was crucified probably for being a militant rebel, like most of the other Messianic Jews of the first century who were crucified were, right?
Yeah.
And so if there was, he had to have been an empty enough vessel to take on different shapes and different meanings to people at different layers. So when we read the letter, I regard the letter of Paul to the Galatians as sort of the Rosetta Stone of the New Testament.
Right.
In that book, we read of an intense argument between Paul and all the previous apostles. Apparently, the leader of the Christian community, a guy named James, is spying out Paul's freedom in Christ. It's such that Cephas and Paul have to confront one another to their face. The argument is so intense that Paul damns Cephas, damns him to hell. This argument in Galatians so disturbed early Christians. St. Jerome, who did the first Latin translation of the New Testament, wrote to his buddies, Augustine and the Pope, what's going on? St. Peter and St. Paul are having these important theological arguments, damning each other, confronting each other. Wow. That argument suggests to me that Paul is really the guy behind the Torah criticism within Messianic Judaism.
Right. That
before him, the apostles were Torah orthodox when it came to things like circumcision and kosher diet, which were the topics of that intense debate.
Right.
I further believe that because in the Gospels, for example, Jesus is critical of kosher diet. Paul never quotes that. It would be so easy for Paul to say, hey, Peter, remember when Jesus said nothing you put into your body is defiles, it's what comes out. So your eating with Gentiles isn't even an issue. Yeah. He doesn't quote Jesus. In fact, had Jesus ever said that, why would James and Cephas be arguing so hard?
Yeah.
They would have gone along with Paul's thing. In fact, Paul goes so far as to say, I didn't get this from other humans. I got this from no man, but my own revelation.
Yeah.
And he makes these arguments, these convoluted, vigorous arguments about why Jesus' resurrection makes us now free in Christ. All of that suggests that before Paul, the apostles were Torah orthodox, probably militant, maybe nationalist. They may not have thought of Jesus in terms of being a god at all. Another thing is Paul may have introduced these pagan Hellenistic ideas and that later really influenced the gospel portrait of Jesus as a God-man, which is totally alien to Judaism. Monotheistic Judaism would never have a Messiah understood as God. That's why Christianity is a wholly new religion. It's got a whole new God. and a God that looks like a pagan God in some ways. Paul seems to be introducing a mystery cult God element to his Messiah that may also be a unique innovation of Paul. So for everything that Paul is arguing for like that, let me suggest he is the guy that came up with it. And the later Gospels are simply, even with their differences with Paul, and Matthew, for example, does have clear differences with Paul. On the other hand, for whatever their differences, the Gospels are in effect demonstrating Paul was right in those arguments he had with Cephas and James. So if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Well, could I ask, with mentioning
Sure.
Paul and him writing first, and then the Gospels coming later, do you have any sense of the possibility, or put it this way, the credibility of the argument that this was purely visions from Paul that got you hemorrhaged, where you're talking, I mean, you're talking about a world where, and again, this is my lack of truly deeply understanding this is more dangerous than anything. I wouldn't presume to be a teacher, but just from what I know, you're talking about people who were steeped in mysticism and dualism, and you have the God, the layers of heaven, the demigods, the angels, and you have people claiming to have visions. You clearly, with Colossians, visions of angels. Clearly, Paul says, "I went up to the third heaven."
Yes, Paul has visions.
Yeah, visions, and other people.
At least they get him to the third, if not the highest level. They at least get him to a level of heaven where he doesn't have to care so much about the earthly concern.
And the Book of Enoch, of course, the apocryphal books.
Yes.
You get the sense that it's, and obviously, I'm sure you're much more well versed than I am.
The ascension of Isaiah.
Yeah, the ascension of Isaiah, but he's potentially an angel that got, and I'm sure you know who I'm thinking of here as the other researcher in my mind, but he was the angel who was crucified up in space, and he got basically...
Let's say it. Dr. Richard Carrier. Famous for his notion that Jesus, even the barest notion of a historical Jesus, was really a celestial being. Yeah. Even his crucifixion, the one historical thing we might know about a Jesus, even the crucifixion occurred in a celestial plane, and that Jesus is nothing but a spiritual entity.
Is that theory plausible given creating Christ's information?
It is possible. It is plausible. It is, just as historicism is plausible under creating Christ. When our book came out, the mythicist Robert Price, who's probably, along with Carrier, the other most famous mythicist scholar on earth, he had been a huge critic of Roman provenance. When Atwill's book, Caesar's Messiah, came out in 2005, he actually vigorously debated Joseph Atwill, dismissed the theory as pretty preposterous. After our book came out, Robert Price completely changed. He said he believes now. He said, I didn't see a way of taking it seriously until Valliant's book came out. And then he even went so far as to say it's created the most plausible historical Jesus for mythicist Robert Price in a rebel Jesus. So what's interesting is the mythicist says this has made historicism more plausible to me. Even the famous mythicist Dr. Price.
Well, could I ask, as a side note to that, would it still work if, and I'm not sure if he's ever addressed this, but would it work to still have a starting point where there was no guy at the beginning, it was just angelic mystical visions, but that they literally created this story at some point, and the Romans got wind of this story and began to say, not the Romans as in everybody, but the powers that be that could influence it, that you mentioned, the rich families and so forth, and the scholars, that they could begin to say, this is a story. There's a lot of stories. There's Mithraism going on. There's Dionysian cults going on. There's a lot of stories. We hear them all. Some of us even go to their temples. But at the same point, this one is starting to sound appealing. It's got some points to it that the others are missing. Let's add to it. Is that possible?
Well, whether or not there was a historical Jesus, because I think it's possible, either one is plausible under a Roman provenance theory. And the evidence that this turns on are just a couple of references in Paul, really. Paul says, Jesus is born of a woman. Paul says he was crucified. Hey, does that concretize, historicize him? Or is Paul going out of his way to say he's born of a woman just because he knows People think it's a myth. I don't know. I do know that there were thousands of Messianic Jews who were crucified in the first century. I do know a bunch of them were named Jesus. I do know a bunch of them claimed to be the Messiah. And now in that crowd of people, were there those who were seen by contemporary Jews as Isaiah's suffering servant, expiating the Jewish sin so that we can now have victory? Okay, you got it on that side. And the other big thing is, look at how the Gospels are written. They're not written from recent memory. Nearly everything in the Gospels is taken literally from some passage in Hebrew Scripture. And I'm not making this up. If let's take the nativity story in Luke. If when the miraculous births of Mary and Elizabeth are announced to them, if they proclaim how fortunate they are above all women, if that sounds just like Hannah, the mother of Samuel in Hebrew Scripture, grateful for her miraculous pregnancy, I mean, linguistically, it becomes, you have to say, look, the author is clearly lifting whole bits and language from Hebrew Scripture, and they're using Hebrew Scripture way more than they're using contemporary records or recent memory. Jesus is, take Matthew's nativity story, the slaughter of the innocents. That's the Moses story. Pharaoh killed the babies, and that's why Moses was put on the Nile River. Go over and over and over. It's, what is it? Let's see, the 30 pieces of silver that Judas betrays him for. Well, Joseph is betrayed by his 12 for 30 pieces of silver. Over Jonah, 3 days in the big fish. Jesus, 3 days in the ground. Now, some of that may have already been developed into messianic ideology, even by the time we get to the Gospels. But the bottom line is that the Hebrew Scriptures are the major source of information and language for the Gospels, not recent memory. More than that, the story itself is itself parabolic in the way Jesus taught. I was going to do this earlier. I may as well do it now. Finish off the Passion narrative. It's clearly a giant parable. Judas, one of the 12, betrays him. He's convicted by the Sanhedrin for violating Mosaic law in a kangaroo court. He's presented to Pilate, who in all four Gospels explicitly announces that Jesus is innocent. And he can find no fault. As far as Pilate seems to be able to determine, this is a theological debate between Jews that he really doesn't care about. So tell me why I should crucify this man. One thing, you know why it's fiction. The Jews could, of course, had Jesus stoned. If the Sanhedrin had wanted to, that let's just add St. Stephen stoned in Acts, or just like the stoning that Jesus interrupts of the sinning woman, let he who was without sin cast the first stone. But we also know from Josephus. Josephus quotes the Roman letters that say the Jews have the right to enforce their own Mosaic law in their own territory. So we know that before the Jewish war, there would have been no need to present Jesus to Pilate. If the Sanhedrin had convicted him of blasphemy or violating Mosaic law, they could have had him stoned all by themselves. So that's fiction. It's just pure fiction. Now, we go to Pilate. To have Pilate declare him innocent in all four Gospels, because then Pilate, apparently there's going to be a riot that'll break out if he doesn't. Okay, well, no, really, in one version, he presents a real rioter, a real rebel, Barabbas. Who should I release? In all four versions, the crowd has to demand artificially 3 times, apparently in unison, crucify Jesus, so that the Jewish crowd gets the blame over the Roman government, which has officially declared him innocent in all four Gospels. So Pilate then, like a cartoon, a political cartoon, melodramatically washes his hands in the basin. You guys, we don't need Matthew to add his blood is on us. The theme of the parable is now obvious. The Jews killed Jesus. The Jews punished an innocent man. The Jews get whatever's coming to them. When these passion play performances were done throughout the Middle Ages, Christians got the message, and mob violence against the local Jews would be the natural upshot of passion play performances in the springtime throughout Europe, in medieval Europe. A lot of anti-Semitic violence is rooted in this idea that the Jews killed Jesus. The Pope did not forgive the Jews collectively for killing Jesus until the 20th century, the 1960s. Within my lifetime, it took them that long for the Catholic Church to say, well, okay, the Jews collectively aren't responsible.
Right.
Because in unison, they're saying, crucify him, crucify him. And what's going on? Peter's denying him 3 times. The disciples never really get it. Jesus constantly has to say, you guys aren't getting it. The first shall be last, the last shall be first. You guys, it's not about this world where an earthly Messiah is to be expected, but about a Platonic world of abstraction. So using Greek philosophy, a little lift from Plato, and suddenly Jesus can say, my kingdom is not of this earth. Completely defanging the idea, the politically charged concept of Messiah. Messiah was like jihad today with the extreme Muslims. Jihad is their rally. Messiah was the rallying cry of the extreme Jews. So the real meaning for most Jews in the first 2 centuries was a militant political one. Christianity is introducing this idea. No. The Messiah's kingdom is in another Platonic dimension. That's the dimension where you should be storing up your treasures.
And that's, I think you mentioned in a different video I was listening to, is that called Neoplatonic dualism?
Completely.
Okay.
It is Platonic, and then the ideas of Plato were actually taking over at about this time in the classical world.
Okay.
Aristotelian ideas had been fading in the Hellenistic times, and now we're beginning to see Neoplatonism in the guise of Roman era philosophers, Greek philosophers like Plotinus and so forth. And these ideas are so closely connected to the metaphysics of Christianity that early Christian writers could see it right away. Probably the most important Christian philosopher, the most systematic in the first 400 years of its history, Augustine, wrote the Confessions in the City of God. He is basically fully integrating consistently Platonic and Neoplatonic ideas with Christianity, which were sort of a mind-body dualism, right? What matters is not this corrupt matter, but your immortal soul, which actually exists in another dimension, and its union with the one, or the perfect, the form of the good in Platonic, very much like Christian union with God. Platonism was sort of displacing Hellenistic ideas, displacing the political messianism of the first 2 centuries.
Yeah. But it amazes me, just apart from all the details, and I feel like I could ask you questions on this for a while, but when you take away the Neoplatonic dualism, you take away the very clear copies of other God stories. Some of it is very clear. Some of it even, I know that with Zoroaster, there's a question of the dating of the stories, but some of it, the whole, going to be baptized, immediately getting into the desert to be tempted, which, even though it sounds identical to Zoroaster, which is amazing itself, it's also a mimicking of going through the Red Sea and so forth, into the desert before the Promised Land. But all these things, you say, okay, this clearly sounds like mythology, or you're copying an old the mimesis. You take that away. When I say take it away, I mean you say this doesn't sound like history. Say, all right, I'm going to put that aside. What's left? There's still a lot, probably a lot left. Okay, you say, all right, well, let's take away the stuff that's clearly a copy of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Okay, let's take away the stuff that is, part of Jewish mythicism, Pythagorean. Clearly this is a copy of a Pythagorean story. You take it away, and by the time you start to take away the stuff that just looks so mythological, you're like, there's not that much left.
This pattern that many scholars before me, and Robert Price is certainly one of them, but many scholars before me had noticed that that Christianity in some ways much more resembles these pagan mystery cults than it does traditional Judaism, which is, a Torah-focused, chosen people-focused religion. It's not about some God man who gives you immortality, who'll help you with the afterlife, right? When we look at pagan gods and goddesses, let's take one good Greek example, the god Asclepius, the healer god. He was the son of a mortal woman and a god, Apollo, the god of prophecy, truth, light. And he has a demigod son, Asclepius, who apparently was born by cesarean section, right? Because like a doctor, a healing god would be, his name sort of implies that he was cut out. Interesting, isn't it? Anyway, Asclepius becomes this healer, and so good at healing, he can resurrect people from the dead. And there are a number of famous characters from Greek mythology he actually raises from the dead, right? This vexes the gods terribly. Mortals are mortals and gods are gods. And so Zeus zaps with his thunderbolt Asclepius for resurrecting people from the dead. Asclepius' father, Apollo, goes to Zeus and says, hey, but my son, it's my son, and he was a good guy, and he's just helping people out. Okay, we'll make him a god. So he enjoys a post-martyrdom apotheosis and becomes a god himself. And his the earliest temples of Asclepius are where Greek hospitals and Greek medicine started. Those of Galen and so forth, Hippocrates, were Asclepius temples, right? And so Asclepius was worshipped, and we can tell this from the inscriptions, both as a healer god and as a god that could ensure a happier afterlife, because he's a resurrection god. He himself was a model because he himself was martyred and resurrected. He was the son of a solar deity and a mortal woman, suffered on earth, martyred, healer god. What a parallel to Jesus, right? Flat on the face of it, right? People, Christians who say, oh, no, that's not a good parallel. You're parallel maniac, you. There was no, for example, when he resurrected everyone else, the gods didn't like that, did they? And there's no physical resurrection for Asclepius, is there? Well, in Egyptian mythology, there was, of course, this important god Osiris. He was the lord of the underworld. He was chopped to bits by his, according to the myth, by his opponent god, right, Seth, and his wife Isis put all the pieces back together and physically resurrected Osiris, the lord of the afterlife, who was also a healer, afterlife god to the Egyptians. The connection wouldn't be so odd if, of course, after the conquests of Alexander the Great, which brought Greek ideas to the whole Middle East, right? Greek generals, after Alexander's conquests, carved up the ancient world. You know, Alexander defeats the Persians. So now we have Greek kings in Syria, Greek kings in Egypt. The last dynasty of Egyptian pharaohs were Greeks, descended from Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals, right? So Ptolemy the first Greek pharaoh of Egypt, creates a new god, a blend of Greek gods and Egyptian gods. And he creates a god specifically by blending Asclepius and Osiris. So he becomes an afterlife god who enjoyed a physical resurrection, who is worshipped for his ability to help everyone in their own afterlife, which Osiris clearly was. And this god was called Serapis, right? The Apis bull was the personification of Osiris. So Osiris Apis, Serapis, becomes his name, and he takes on the Greek identities of Apollo and Asclepius, and he takes on the Greek identity of Osiris, so that we have what's known as a syncretism, a blending of two gods into a new unified god. So 300 years before Christ, the patron god of Egypt, the leading god of the Alexandrians in Egypt, was the lord of the underworld, who gave you a better afterlife, who healed people, resurrected people, and himself a demigod who enjoyed a physical resurrection, which is the model for all of us. His devotees worshipped him for a better afterlife and as a healing god. And because he'd been a mortal who'd suffered on earth, we can better relate to him. And there's an indwelling presence. The cult of Serapis inherited from Dionysius this: you drink in the god transforms you inside. You have this personal experience. It's a transformation experience because the god becomes a part of you. The priests at Eleusis, where Dionysus was worshipped, helped set up the Serapis cult. So that all three of these ideas, right? Asclepius the healer, Osiris who was physically resurrected, Dionysus the indwelling personal transformer god, so that it became a personal salvation cult 300 years before Christ.
You know what's amazing to me, just as you say all that, and that's, I've heard parts of that before. I've certainly heard other parallels, you know, with the Mithraism and some of the other deities and mystery cults, but the first thing I think about is what I would have said before and what I know anyone else would say now, which is that one was myth, that one was myth, that one was myth, that one was myth, but this one's different.
Right.
And at some point, it does come back to this question of at what point are people willing to say, maybe the fact that it looks so much like all these others is because it is like the others. It's different. It's unique. It's obviously the blood sacrificial atonement. It's going to look like a Jewish mystery cult. Obviously, it's supposed to. That's what they wanted.
We have
but it is a mystery cult.
sources. We have second century sources that are third century sources too that are critical of Christianity, saying, "Oh, it's nothing but the Serapis religion. It's Serapis." Yep. We have a Christian writer, Justin Martyr, in the middle of the second century saying, "Oh, well, of course, Christianity was here long before Christ. It's echoed in all of your mythologies." Even a Christian writer like Justin Martyr is explicitly comparing Jesus Christ to all these other pagan suffering savior gods.
Yeah.
Furthermore, we see things coming together in the first century in a very interesting way. When Vespasian, the Roman general who defeats the Jews in the Jewish war, he's the father of Titus, who defeats them, who does the siege of Jerusalem, but he basically conquers Galilee and most of Judea. And it's right when he's doing that that Nero dies. There's a Roman civil war, and Vespasian becomes the emperor. Now, Vespasian, when he becomes emperor, on his way to Rome, he stops in Alexandria. And at the Serapeum, he performs healing miracles. Now, that makes sense. Serapis was a healing god. But he performs healing miracles, according to Tacitus and Suetonius, early second century historians, that are identical to healing miracles performed by Jesus in the Gospels. He cures a blind man with spittle. He cures the withered limb with touch. Jesus performs in the Serapeum the healing miracles that make sense for a Serapis, that are Jesus's. But because he's conquered the Jews, his Jewish priest who went over to his side, Josephus, says, "Oh, and he's also the true Jewish Messiah." So Vespasian, on his coins, will put Serapis' image on one side and his own image on the other. "I am the new Serapis." But also, according to his mythology, his propaganda, he was the true Jewish Messiah. And a Jewish priest is saying so. So all the rich Jews around Vespasian have to regard Vespasian as the true Messiah. And yet he's a God-man and a healer demigod like Serapis. So here we have all of those elements coming together in Vespasian. Now, as far as I'm concerned, there's never been a divine Jewish Messiah apart from Jesus and Vespasian and his son. They combine features of these mystery cult savior gods like Serapis and the qualities of being the Jewish Messiah prophecy. That happens only twice. These Flavian emperors in the first century and Jesus, the gospel stories of which are written in the late first century.
Ironic? Maybe a little bit.
No, when we read Josephus, we hear about exorcisms being performed in front of Vespasian by a Jewish exorcist. Josephus tells us about his own prophetic dreams, which tell him that God has gone over to the Roman side. I'm still a good Jew, and I'm having prophetic dreams. It's just that God has gone over to Vespasian, the true Messiah. And he's got Jewish authorities calling him the true Messiah. So Vespasian and his son combine these features. Now, it wouldn't even be so creepy if the coins, the religious and political propaganda of Rome was promoted a lot on their coins, as you can imagine. Here's a great opportunity. The coins jingling in your pockets actually would promote Roman government and religion. So what would they say? Pax orbis terrarum, peace on earth. Clementia, mercy or compassion. Spes, hope. Concordia, harmonia. So the very thing that the Gospel of Luke's angels proclaim is coming with Jesus, peace on earth, goodwill toward men, is on the coins that are jingling in people's pockets when the Gospel of Luke is written. Pax orbis terrarum. Concordia, harmonia. So peace on earth, goodwill toward men is exactly what Roman religious and political propaganda is saying on their coins. I began to notice
Amazing.
all of these things coming together, that Flavian propaganda, which highlighted the benevolent, altruistic character of the emperors, the Emperor Titus, stripped all his own mansions of their goods and gave it all to the poor.
Hmm.
Pliny the Elder says, God, because like a father, he loves us all. He loves us more than our own fathers do. And it's that benevolence, it's that peace that he brings to the world. The bringer of peace. That's what makes him a god. And that's a Roman. So the ideas that were current, see, people think of Christianity over here and Roman culture over here in this huge titanic clash of cultures. Serapean religion of these suffering mystery god, right? The notion of altruism, peace on earth, compassion and mercy, that was proclaimed on Roman coins. That's what the Roman emperors were selling themselves as. So it simply struck me that the New Testament is largely Roman propaganda, designed to pacify. It wasn't first aimed at everybody. They didn't think that Christian literature would convert the whole Roman Empire. It was targeted at a specific group that were either rebelling or in danger of being sucked into the rebellion. So it's a new form of Messianic Judaism, and you'd expect Messianic Judaism to be Torah orthodox and militant, right? But no, paradoxically, Christianity combines those Torah criticism with a Messianic Judaism. Anti-nationalism, anti-militism with what you'd think would be a militant Messiah. No, you got it all wrong. His kingdom is not of this earth. He's a pacifist preacher of love who says the kingdom is already here if you just look into your own soul. Totally pagan ideas.
It's amazing. Just reflecting on it, it's this. I know we've gone longer than I thought, but this has been awesome. It feels like this is, again, it hits me as number one. This is stuff that it needs to be told, and that's great that you're telling it. It should be, 101 for Bible college students. I mean, you should know this stuff. If only, even if you want to keep your faith, if only to defend it apologetically,
it's
say,
the
hey,
basic
I've got an
historical
answer to that.
context. Shouldn't we know the political and cultural context in which Christianity emerged? And once we do, aren't the answers rather readily apparent? Just like with every other topic. I mean, when I was in school, they'd say, well, put it in context. If you want to understand the assassination of Julius Caesar or the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, put it into its historical context. It'll make sense. Bing. Same with the New Testament.
Amazing.
I cannot tell you whether there was a historical Jesus, but I can tell you that most of the New Testament was a critical reaction to the Messianic Jews of the first 2 centuries.
Yeah. It makes me think a lot about have you ever seen, it makes me think of the movie The Matrix. I'm sure you've seen it, but the scene where Neo is out, he's in their little, spaceshipy thing, and he's first getting trained, and when he first gets the metal put in his head, and he's like, what are you doing? And they're like, well, we're going to teach you jujitsu. And he's like surprised, and they suddenly download jujitsu into his head in 5 seconds.
Or how to fly a helicopter.
And he's like, whoa!
Whoa!
It's just blowing his mind, and it feels like this is the kind of stuff that it does. It blows your mind, and it blows your mind as to how much you haven't heard of it, how much you needed it, and how much it puts it into a different perspective. And I find it really hard to believe that people, if they were willing to come at it with open mind, saying, I want to put, just even for sake of argument, I want to put my presuppositions aside, just see the facts as they land. Where does this lead me? And it's really hard to think that people could take it and say, this is literally exactly how it happens.
There are mythicists and there are Roman providence theorists who treat Christianity like a joke, some kind of Roman joke. It's not serious. I am not one of them. I believe that both the Hebrew scriptures and Christian scriptures have beautiful poetry and important moral truths, and they represent, in effect, the best literary and philosophical thinking that was done at the time. Now, the people who actually wrote the New Testament may have thought the Gospels were only true in an allegorical parable sense,
Right.
and perhaps meant only to be taken literally by the masses.
Right.
On the other hand, I do believe that they thought that there were at least metaphorical truths and allegorical truths to be put there. Some of the language is just beautiful, you know. If you just hear it in Greek, it is even beautiful. But like some of those English translations, the King James translation, you know, that wonderful Peanuts Christmas special where Linus, you know, Charlie Brown says, "Won't someone tell me what the real meaning of Christmas is?" And they do the spotlight on Linus, and Linus, I'll tell you what the real meaning of Christmas is, Charlie Brown. And he quotes that beautiful passage from Luke's nativity scene. Now think about it. The birth of peace symbolized by the birth of a baby. That is poetically beautiful. If you're not moved in one sense by, yeah, let's just put aside all of our conflicts and put aside all war and consider the miracle of a baby's birth. Just right there, it's just this beautiful scene. And if you're not moved by that, I don't know if you're a human being, frankly. But the point is that however we come down on Christian ethics or Christianity as literal history, the truth is these were important truths to some very good and wise people for thousands of years. And I'm not one to dismiss the import. Look at the art of Michelangelo, the music of Handel's Messiah, some of the most beautiful art and poetry ever created was done by sincere Christians trying to concretize their vision. So I'm not one to dismiss Christian culture, and like some are who are atheists. I think we should look for the good and the beautiful and reject the stuff that's not so good or beautiful because it is awfully old stuff. But the point is, we keep our critical mind, but we don't lose it. We don't let ourselves go and say, well, you know, I was burned by Christianity, therefore they're a bunch of jerks and that's it for me. I think there's a danger on both sides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm amazed at what I'm learning, and I've only got about 300 more questions for you. So I hope we can, maybe more.
Yeah.
I hope we can keep
I hope so
we can
too.
keep digging a little bit, because
Let's do more of these.
Yeah, there's things people need to know, and I think I'd love to dive into too the aspect of the psychology of both atheistic psychology, but much more. I'm fascinated by the psychology of the people that this is anathema. I will not believe this stuff. In fact, I won't even entertain it. You are trying to get people to disbelieve in Jesus, and there's a psychology there that for people like myself who have a lot of people around me who are stuck in what I call the Bible prison. There's an aspect of this where it's so entrenched, and it's so like blinders.
A healthy psychology, in my view, is one that is grateful for correction.
Yes.
When someone points out to me, "Oh, Jim, you missed that," or "Jim, you know, you really got that wrong," or "Jim, you know, you may want to rethink that," and it turns out, "Boy, you were right," or "Boy, you had a point at least," I come back every time. Yeah. Thank you. What else do you think I could improve on?
The bigger the issue,
my response. Yeah.
The bigger the issue get corrected on, the bigger of a thank you. This wasn't like you put the wrong date for this, the dating of this book, this ancient book. Like, okay, if I said it was 75, it's actually 80. That's a small thing, but come on.
Yeah.
Major
thing. Oh, I stand in gratitude. You know, Isaac Newton has the famous quote, and it comes from Isaac Newton, of all people, one of the greatest scientists who ever lived. He said, "If I have seen further than others, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants." And boy, I mean, if you think about it, he's maybe the biggest, him and Einstein or something, are like the biggest giants in all of physics. But coming from a giant, that really says something. He knew that without Galileo and Kepler and even Aristotle, he could never have done what he did.
Yeah.
And this is true for all of us. The other thing, and knowledge develops. We have to be patient with the process.
Yeah.
We can't force the process. People have to do it in their own way, in their own time. I think there are two psychological things, one more philosophical and one more psychological. On the philosophical side of it, there's a false dichotomy between dogmatism and skepticism. In moral terms, between moral absolute priggishness, and on the other hand, anything goes, do what you want, molest children, kill people, whatever, right? Who cares? There's no such thing as rights or good or bad. It's just human imagination. So that false alternative has only been played into, I think, and unfortunately, by a lot of secular, excuse me, I'll introduce you to Maximus.
Hey!
Asia. Oh,
Is that two dogs?
Yeah.
Two different dogs?
Yeah, I'm sure they may want to take a break here.
Sure.
There's someone pulling up here to
Gotcha.
wrap up.
Yeah.
But I do have, let me just finish with you the thought.
Yeah.
That false alternative between dogmatism and skepticism is terrible. Real knowledge is always contextual.
Yeah.
If we believe this, and this, then this is more likely than this. That's the way real thinking goes. Right. It's not I now know everything absolutely true and that'll never be affected by anything else I ever know. That's absurd. Of course, it'll be your knowledge will be affected when you learn. And then the total skepticism, well, even that doesn't make sense. They always say it this way: there are no absolutes, or mankind can know anything. Well, is that something you know? It's just a self-contradiction. Yeah. So on both sides, but the atheists are on this side, and unfortunately, they've played into it, in my view. Instead of saying we can have contextual, better than tentative, but not dogmatic truth. And on the other hand, we have to be able to question everything along the way. And the psychological thing I was going to say is insecurity and pride.
Yes.
If someone gets in an argument especially, if someone commits to a position, it's very hard for them to later say, okay, I guess I was wrong about that whole thing. You know what I mean? Yeah. So there's a psychological self-esteem. So it takes a certain amount of self-esteem and confidence to say, I was wrong.
Yeah.
Boy, did I make some big mistakes. Yeah. So you have to be able to psychologically be comfortable with yourself as having made mistakes, as a fallible, all humans are fallible, as a fallible human being. And on the other hand, philosophically, you can't dive into one of the two false alternatives of total skepticism or complete dogmatism, because truth is just a contextual thing.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does, and I'd love to. I was thinking too earlier, just a quick note for a future conversation. I'd love to dive into the addiction of religion, the sense of, and this isn't to. I know you got to go, but the sense of, just for a future conversation, the sense of it. It feels good to have my cosmic daddy tell me, "Hey, little boy, you're doing a great job. That's a great drawing. I'm so proud of you." And it also feels really bad to say, hey, I'm going to discipline you if you don't get in line. The
it's
addiction,
our parents, isn't it?
Yeah. It's
my psychologist, my best friend works at the county psychiatric hospital as a shrink. And in his view, that's really what it is. It's parent psychology. It's needing the authority of daddy still there.
Yeah.
Daddy said, daddy approves, daddy doesn't approve. Yep. In his mind, that explains a lot of ordinary religious psychology.
Yeah. And it may even be a literal chemical issue where when you pray, something feels so good, like you get this approval and it floods your brain.
Approval and security. Yeah. Daddy or mommy giving us the smile.
Yeah, and it's hard. It's so hard to tell people, hey, I know this is hard to step away, but just even in theory, try. Just for the sake of argument, try to imagine, what if I'm wrong? What if this whole thing is truly mythology? Might have some good messages to weave in, but messages I can probably get from other religions anyway. But the actual core of it is mythology, and despite the good stuff, there's a lot of bad stuff too, especially if you're going to tell me that if you don't fall in line and believe exactly this, you're going to go burn in hell.
You're burning in hell, baby.
Yeah, you're burning in hell. And I'd love to. I feel like we could do probably a whole show on the addiction of it.
No. I really like this. I actually like. This is unlike any other podcast I've ever done because you are free forming in it. I love this casual conversation mode.
Yeah.
And we could talk about religion and philosophy in 3 more videos, I'm sure. Your style is that way. You bring out the very best in my own sort of philosophic thinking. And I like that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I love what you bring to the table. It's awesome. And I definitely want to weave into, your writing and your research too, because I know it's, we want to be promoting all the research you've done, which is awesome. And I have a lot of questions. I really do. And I think as I maybe get a little more research, I know you recently mentioned, the cult of Sol Invictus, Mithraism, some of the connections, even some of the connections to Islam. I know you've done a lot more research that we haven't even touched on. And
Yes.
we have a lot to dig into, but
Right.
I'll just end by saying I deeply appreciate your time. I appreciate your expertise and your heart in this. And I appreciate too that you have a way I've seen in many of your interviews that you're not out there trying to be antagonistic, that you get the sense that there's an argument to be made, so to speak. There's a discussion to be had, but we're not going to get there by bashing anybody, by making people feel stupid. We're going to get there by keeping lines of communication open. And I appreciate that that's been consistent in what
Absolutely.
I see as you.
Thank you
So,
very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So hopefully that's infectious to other people as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll just say thank you for your help and thank you for your time, and we'll do it again soon.
Yes, let's do it again soon.
All right. Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.